Welcome to our Japanese style living environment webinar series. We'll soon be in conversation with Dr. Frank L. Chance about the aesthetics of the Japanese style living environment. Thank you for joining us. Thanks to our partners who make this programming possible, the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership and the Oakland Fukuoka Sister City Association. My name is Peter Boyer, your moderator. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Frank L. Chance. Dr. Frank L. Chance will share his knowledge of how the living environment is more than just the architecture and the grounds. It's the human interior that fully inhabits a given place. It's been said that nothing is inherently meaningful. We bring meaning to it. Frank has lived and traveled in Japan. He brings this personal experience, as well as experience as executive director at Shofuso, the Japanese house and garden in Fairmount Park, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, USA, to this presentation. He serves as secretary of the Japan America Society of Greater Philadelphia, the organization that oversees the preservation of Shofuso. Since retiring as the associate director of the Center for East Asian Studies in Philadelphia, Frank has undertaken the Shikoku 88 Temple pilgrimage on foot, presented on the subject in Japan, North America, and Europe, and published an article on it in Education About Asia. He has also written about modern Japanese prints in the Journal of Japanese Studies. His next publication will be about the late Edo eclectic painter Tani Buncho. He collaborates with the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the United States Japan Foundation programs to train American teachers to include Japanese studies in their curriculum. We're about to start our webinar event. I'm your moderator. My name is Peter Boyer, and I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Frank L. Chance. And those of you who caught Frank's earlier webinar, Introduction to Traditional Japanese Architecture, know what you're in for today, and that was just a super presentation. And it kind of makes me want to live in one of them. Well, it just so happens Frank Chance, he lived in Japan for nearly a decade. And so he's going to bring his personal experience there, as well as his experience with many other endeavors. And I'm going to give you a taste of those. Frank came to the webinar through the Shofuso, which is the public house and garden in Philadelphia. It's a traditional Japanese structure, literally dismantled and shipped over here and reassembled. And a lovely garden surrounding it, producing the classic residential Sukiya style, or calling it Japanese style here, but the kind of living environment perfected in the late Edo era, which is known as Sukiya style living environment. And in a presentation on the aesthetics of the Japanese style living environment, Frank is going to fill you in. I'm not going to steal his thunder, but you're going to really get a sense of the nature of that experience and the meaning and what it adds to your life. So Frank was executive director at Shofuso, and he's currently the secretary of the Japan America Society of Greater Philadelphia, which is the organization that's running Shofuso, as well as many other activities. Frank is a former associate director of the Center for East Asian Studies in Philadelphia. Philadelphia, I gotta go there. Got a lot going on. Frank's also undertaken the Shikoku 88 Temple pilgrimage, and on foot, no less. So those of you who know all about the pilgrimage in Spain, that sounds somewhat similar. All right. He's also a published author, for example, in the journal Education About Asia, the Journal of Japanese Studies. And in that vein, he also collaborates with the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the United States Japan Foundation programs to train American teachers who are trying to include Japanese studies in the high school curriculum. So, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Frank.
Can you hear me now?
I hear you, Frank.
Okay, I will
Okay, they hear you, Frank. Take it away. Take it from the top.
All right, take it from the top, he says. I come to this program through sort of two routes. One is through the Japan American Society that Peter mentioned. The other is as a member of NAJGA, the North American Japanese Garden Association. So I've had a lot to do with gardens and houses from Japan and in Japan over a long career of sometimes living in Japan, sometimes living here and teaching about Japan and so forth. But let me get right down to the business of what we're going to do today.
Hey, Frank, you might want to tell us what your background slide there is. Is that Shofuso?
Oh, the background behind me is the Shofuso garden. I'm not actually in it today. That's just a virtual background photograph.
Thanks.
But that's a garden that was created in the late 1950s, designed by Sano Tansai. Sano was a garden designer in Kyoto, came from a long family of garden designers who are particularly associated with places like Joanji, the famous rock garden. And Sano designed the garden that was around the Japanese house, the Shofuso, when it was in New York. It was originally built by the Rockefellers and others with donations from the Rockefeller family and from various Japanese sources as an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And then that was opened in 1954. It was there for a couple of years, had about 250,000 visitors. And then in 1958, it was moved to the Fairmount Park in Philadelphia. And they had to build a completely new garden. Although it was a site, it's on a site that has had Japanese gardens since literally the first Japanese garden in the United States. It built for the 1876 Centennial Exposition. So it's a place that has a long history of Japanese buildings and gardens. I was director there through almost the entire decade of the 1990s. And then I went back into academic life as associate professor and also worked for a while at Princeton as a bibliographer in the art library there. Came back to Philadelphia in 2002. And for 15 years, I was the director of the associate director of the Center for East Asian Studies at Penn. Um, my wife also teaches at Penn in Japanese literature. My training is as a historian of Japanese art. Um, I wrote my dissertation about uh, 18th and 19th century literati painting, but I've also written about gardens, and I consider myself a general specialist. So I sort of do everything. Um, today's talk is kind of in two parts. Um, and let me just say that the first part is a kind of history of Japanese aesthetics. Doesn't concentrate so much on the living environment as on the history of aesthetic concept in Japan. Um, and then the second part, I'll talk more about the living environment and living in the Japanese environment, and trying to do so aesthetically, if you will. So Japanese art can be broken down a lot of different ways. I would break it down into about half a dozen big periods, 500-600 year long periods, growing shorter as we get closer and closer to the present. Each period has its own cultural developments and its own styles, but each period also builds on and keeps features from the earlier periods. So just to make the ground level before I get started, I will talk a bit about those changes and revivals in some ways of aesthetic ideas. I want to resist the idea of simplifying it too much. I'll take one example right here and say there's a lot of talk out there in the world about wabi-sabi. And to my understanding, that condenses things a bit too much. We should talk about wabi and sabi. They're two different things. They're related. They're certainly linked with each other, but they're different. We'll get there when we get there. There's plenty of contradiction and paradox built into this. Like any culture, Japan is not internally consistent. Things happen that don't make sense from another viewpoint within the same culture. Finally, I'm a scholarly American. That's the way I have to look at things. So I'm not quite as Japanese as some Japanese scholars. But I do like the Japanese language. I think the terminology that the Japanese use is often very useful for us to understand the concept. Historically speaking, I'll point out selected events along the way. I'm not trying to give a complete history of Japan today. And my focus is cultural rather than political, although again, they're very closely interlocked. For various reasons, there's kind of a focus on disaster and recovery, which are important elements throughout Japanese history, as we shall see. Again, I'm an art historical American. I'm an early modernist by training. Actually, some people would say I'm a late early modernist by training. That's a joke. But if we go, let my sound play out for a second. If we go back to the very beginning of Japanese culture, the first things we know about, even from the very beginning, there's a sense of kami. That can be translated as God, usually with a small g. It can be, it's maybe more accurate to say spirit, or the sense of awe, or my students' favorite term, awesomeness, awesome. It has to do with sacredness and holiness and the appearance of that holiness in our world, so immanence. I'm starting with an image from Neolithic Japanese ceramics, some of which are ritual vessels, some of which are images that appear to have magical or supernatural power. And while we don't have literature from these people to tell us what these images meant, there's a strong sense of power in them. That power is encouraged by purity. So where in English we might say cleanliness is next to godliness, in Japan, cleanliness is godliness. And we're going to see that play out in the living environment in emphasis on being clean, keeping things clean. That spiritual power is also repelled by pollution. And that pollution can be anything from the natural monthly cycle that women go through, which was perceived as polluting at certain moments, to drunkenness, all sort of dirt of any sort, which turns the power off. That doesn't mean Japanese didn't get dirty. They did. That doesn't mean they didn't get drunk. They did that too. And in fact, even their gods get drunk. So lots of things going on with that. It's also not tied to any specific religion. We think of it as very Shinto, but it's also there as an aspect of the Buddhist experience as well. Before I move on too far, if you have questions, be sure you put them in the question and answer box. I can't see that necessarily while I'm talking, but Peter will keep track of it and stop me, and we can answer questions as we go along, or we'll stop about an hour into the talk to have a specific question and answer session. Okay. My next concept that I think develops is later term for it is miyabi. That character can also be read ga, meaning elegance, refinement. It all has a lot to do with being courtly. So we associate it with the imperial family, with goings on at the imperial court and elsewhere. My first image here is of a Kofun tomb, mound tomb, and yes, these little boxes beside it are houses, which shows you how big the mound tomb is. I like to say this is the first work of Japanese art that I saw in Japan, because I looked down out of the window of the airplane arriving at the old Osaka Itami airport as we were going right over this tomb. So I could actually see it from the plane. That elegance can also be linked to the import of Chinese culture beginning in about the 4th or 5th century and occurring in waves, 4th to the 8th centuries. Then there's kind of a break, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, another wave of Chinese influence, another break, 18th century, another wave of Chinese influence, and so forth. It's not only in static arts like sculpture and painting, but it's also there in dance, drama. I don't know if you can hear the music when it plays over these, uh, but if we were in person, I would be playing you small selections of music associated with these ideas. So this image is of a court dance brought in from Tang Dynasty China in the 8th century and still performed every year at shrine, the Itsukushima Shrine on Miyajima Island just off of Hiroshima. This kind of culture, its first peak may be around the time when Emperor Shomu built Todaiji, the Great Eastern Temple, the building that still is the largest wooden building in the world, built in Nara and opened in 752. Those Chinese elegant models are brought into Japan, and then over time they are made more and more Japanese, adapted to the Japanese circumstance, the Japanese family, which plays out a little differently from the Chinese family, and so forth. And maybe the greatest literary expression of them is in the Tale of Genji, written by a woman, Murasaki Shikibu, right around the year 1000. But that same sense of elegance comes back. This is an early 18th century painting with, again, a very elegant courtly expression. That may not be obvious unless you know the history and the literature, but this is at first glance just looks like a painting of a field of irises on a golden ground. But in fact, it's divided into 8 sections. A link back to the 8-planked bridge over the iris field, referred to in a very famous poem from the 9th century, that refers to the blooming of the iris as the, on the one hand, it's expressed as the love of the poet's life. But on the other hand, it's clear that he's also referring to his love of the emperor, his love of the court. And he's writing the poem when he's in exile in Eastern Japan. So this is one of the aspects that's going to play through Japanese history. 794. So the end of the 8th century, the Emperor Kammu moves the capital from Nara to Heian. It's only about, it's only about 45 miles, but it reflects the building of a new capital in the style of the Tang Chinese capital, a new opportunity to express that elegance in courtly ways. And by the beginning of the 11th century, around the year 1000, Murasaki Shikibu writes this novel that reflects the peak of the aesthetic development in some ways of that courtly culture. So in her story, we see the glorification of this idea of aware. I hope you can read that at the top of the screen. This idea of awareness, sensitivity, pathos in some ways, but pathos sounds kind of negative, and this has both negative and positive feelings. It's the that you experience when something amazing happens. That could be the sound of a cuckoo in the mountains in the spring. It could be the blossoming and then falling of the cherry blossoms in the spring. It could be the turning of the autumn colors in the fall. Even the falling of snow outside your window can cause it. As we see in the tale of Genji, though, it frequently occurs when one of the main male characters, this guy in the corner, peeks in, catches a glimpse of the beautiful women of the court, relaxed and unaware that they're being seen by a peeping Tom. So if there's a little bit of sexiness attached to it, that's perfectly accurate. Maybe even a little sense of the fact that this is forbidden, out of sight for most of the population. So there are always things out there that we can't see that are attractive and drawing us to them. That plays out in addition in the poetry of this period, written by both men and women in vernacular language, for the expression of which a whole writing system was developed. A writing system that later comes to be particularly associated with women and the women's hand in writing hiragana, but which was also practiced by men. Don't get the idea wrong, there were plenty of very well-educated women who read Chinese and could write Chinese characters, as well as a lot of men who, of course, read and wrote Chinese characters. Men tended to keep their diaries in Chinese as the formal language of the court. Women often kept their diaries in hiragana, in Japanese, as a kind of gentler, more vernacular language. But there are also men who write in hiragana in imitation of women, women who write in characters in imitation of men. So it gets shared around the situation. This sense of aware or awareness often is tinged with a bit of melancholy. So we get stories like the famous poetess who we saw in the previous image, here shown washing her poetry, trying to wash away the attachment that she's developed for certain men. So Genji Monogatari, written in this very cursive hand, mostly in hiragana, but with some Chinese characters around the year 1000. Illustrated, our earliest illustrations that survive are from around 1100. And we might compare them to Chinese paintings from a little bit earlier. And see that though there's a similar courtliness, the Japanese women are wearing very different clothing from the Chinese women. They're actually very different physical shapes. The Chinese ideal of beauty had to do with these full-figured robust women, where the Japanese version tends to be more slender, but with lots and lots of clothing. In both versions, you get attendants, not only the court ladies, but their attendants, both male and female. And the same thing we can see not only the court lady here in the center of the Japanese image, almost obscured by her robes, surrounded by her attendants. Fast forward a couple of hundred years. That Heian courtly culture falls, loses power, never completely disappears, but power is taken over by warriors in the provinces. At the same time, Buddhism stages a flourishing and emphasizes ideas like mujo, constant change, or as we said it in the 60s, constant change is here to stay. That's particularly worked out in the Zen school of Buddhism that emphasizes meditation, but also talks about that ephemerality, the change in the world, the way we perceive the world as being either clear and direct, or diffuse and essentialized, or some link between those two. We can tie this to Yugen, the dark mystery that is at the center of the No drama. And in some ways, it peaks around the time of the Mongol attempt to invade Japan in 1274. Another one of those disasters that changes Japanese history. In this case, the change is that the Japanese military government works very hard to repel the Mongols and essentially goes bankrupt as a result. That results in 100 years or so of real chaos as the shoguns are unable to control all of Japan, and we enter the so-called Warring States period, when areas all over the country strive for power and eventually strive to reunify Japan. Through all of this, of course, there's an emperor in the capital, often living in relative poverty. This is the period in the 15th and 16th centuries when tea culture comes to the fore. Tea culture had been brought to Japan originally in the 9th century, didn't catch on. Second wave of importation at the end of the 12th century. And then tea catches on among the military class, among the priests of the Zen sect, and eventually develops its own tea aesthetic. At the core of that is this concept of wabi, austerity. The word has a homonym that means apology. So it's almost like you're apologizing for having a beautiful pot, or for drinking your tea from a beautiful bowl. It has other homonyms that have to do with withered, sparse trees, restraint, and the development of the Soan tea huts, tiny rooms built of the simplest material, but handled in the most elegant possible way. It's natural. It uses not beautifully symmetrical Chinese tea bowls or tea equipment, but free form, uneven, asymmetrical pieces that look like they just naturally grew. When asked to explain what this was, one of the great tea masters quotes a poem from a couple of hundred years earlier. To the person who longs only for flowers, spring shows in the grass beneath the snow. So if you're the kind of person who wants that miyabi, that sense of the glorious, beautiful flowers, don't forget that the sprout of the first plant beneath the snow also has a kind of powerful beauty. Related concept is sabi. Literally written sometimes with a character that means rust. It can also be written with a character that means loneliness. So it's patina, the loneliness of an object that's been used and maybe neglected, but even more so of an object that's been used and loved over generations and years. That links to the kintsugi practice of repairing broken tea bowls and continuing to use them. And they actually become more valuable after breakage and repair than they were when they were fresh and new. A way of a similar kind of poem that was quoted to explain that. Looking out, not cherry blossoms or crimson leaves, but a hut by an inlet in an autumn dusk. That's the sabi ideal. So linked to wabi, tied to it, but two separate ways of perhaps coming at the same ideas. Those two poems were quoted, in fact, by this man, Senno Rikyu, the tea master who develops Chanoyu tea practice into its currently practiced form. He dies in 1591 as the country is just on the brink of unification from all those wars. Another event that's going on when Rikyu is at his peak of influence is the coming of Westerners to Japan. In 1549 or so, there is a shipwreck, Portuguese ship wrecks on an island in the far south of Japan. The Portuguese sailors survive, rebuild the ship essentially, and then have established contact with Japan. And over the next 100 years or so, there's a lot of contact, Christian missionaries, Christian traders, bringing Western ideas to Japan. This is a time when the aesthetic concept of iki develops and comes to the fore. Iki is a little hard to translate. Like many of these terms, it's got a homophone. Iki literally means to live, written with a different character. Written with this character, it has to do with style, stylishness, being up to date, being up to the moment. That's tied to the concept of tsu. The tsu is a person who knows everything about something. He may not know everything about everything, but he knows everything about something. For example, you might get the sense that this gentleman sitting on the ground, looking up at a gourd of sake, knows exactly what the sake from each province of Japan tastes like. It's also a reference back to an old Chinese story. So there's a level of connoisseurship and understanding that we might not get as modern viewers, that in fact modern Japanese viewers might not get, but the inside joke is clear to the inside connoisseur who knows what's going on. That links to the idea of mitate, where one image may have many levels of meaning. Yes, this is a pretty girl looking at a sleeping boy, pretty boy from the 1760s. They're in the elegant setting of maple blossom viewing in the fall. But here too, there's a complicated story going on. It's tied to the Chinese story or myth of Kantan, Chinese man named Kantan, who lays down and while he's waiting for his dinner to be made, lies down and dreams that he gets married, that he's happy, that he has kids, that he has grandkids, wakes up and the rice is boiled. So the idea of having a whole lifetime in a 15-minute dream. Uh, 1736, the Kyoho reforms allow foreign books to come into Japan, and there's a whole change in culture again. But there were also lots of rules. Men could not wear elaborate kimono. So you see the lady here holding the coat for her gentleman friend, showing off the painting that's inside the jacket. So it can't be seen when he's on the street, but all of his friends know it's there. Another aspect of this, and particularly this time period in the 17th, 18th, into the 19th century, that period we call Edo, for the capital center of power being in the city that today is Tokyo. Another aspect of this is humor. So I've used the term kokkei here. Literally means slipping and falling. Japan, as elegant as all that elegance is, it also has slapstick humor. Funny guys who sat on the street corner and told ribald stories that are full of jokes and humor. The Japanese language is particularly adept at making puns. So the same sounds may have many different meanings. Uh, that plays out in a visual sense in visual puns. So here we have an old story of Dharma, the Zen Buddhist master who came from China, uh, seeing a courtesan, but here the heads of the courtesan and Dharma have been switched. So immediately you look at this and it's funny. It's a laughable image. That's one level of visual pun. Might be harder for us to get the idea of a beautiful woman surfing, if you will. But this ties to the story of Dharma, that same Zen master, crossing a river in a reed boat. But when the story was written down, the scribe left out the word boat. So it becomes Dharma crossing the river on a reed and inventing surfing in the process. That's a joke. That's the kind of joke that they loved in 18th century Japan. Interestingly, this same humorous process ties to the development of haikai poetry, which we now know as haiku. The terminology changes in the 19th century. And masters like Basho, who develops this form to its early peak, again, right around the year 1700. It even plays out in garden culture. So here we see a garden built around this time in Kumamoto, the far south end of Japan. And do you all see the joke? It's got an image of Mount Fuji on the far south end of Japan. You can't see Fuji from there. And there are Fuji mounds like this in any number of Japanese gardens built in the 18th and 19th centuries. In fact, this garden has references throughout to the whole Tokaido road that links Edo with Kyoto, the two capitals where the shogun and the imperial family resided. Another side we might not think of is the concept of hade, of gaudiness, that as popular culture develops in particular, some people strive to wear the brightest kimono, to have the loudest music, to make the craziest jokes. So as Bob Dylan once said, nothing succeeds like excess. It can be brash, bold, brilliantly colored. So the two sides of Japanese culture, the monochrome and the colorful, coexist through much of its history. And much as we might love the Tsukiya style with its simplified, pared down buildings, we have to remember that Japan also builds things like the Yomeimon Sunset Gate at Nikko, where you're supposed, it's sunset because you can stand and look at the gate and try to read the stories in the decoration, in all the paintings and all of the figures, and stand there looking at it until the sun goes down and you can't see it anymore. This hade style is particularly linked to new money, new power, and as time goes on, becomes more and more refined, turning to other things. Middle of the 18th century, in the matter of a year, there's a fire that destroys 30% of the city of Edo, another fire that destroys 20% of the city of Kyoto, and 4 major typhoons hit Japan that year, an event that wasn't repeated until 2020, when 4 major typhoons hit Japan. Fast forward to the 19th century, Commodore Perry arrives and comes back and opens Japan to the West in the next year. Whole new set of aesthetic concerns arrive before and with Perry. Notions of Makoto sincerity as we move into the Meiji period, the Western calendar, wars in Korea against China and Russia. Western style clothing is adopted for both men and later for women. The wars against China and ultimately the annexation of Korea after the war with Russia in 1910. This Makoto is truth, veracity, sincerity, both of the heart, but also of the eye, as we see more and more what we would call realistic depictions coming in with oil painting from the West. Another expression of that is haikara, literally high-collared. So if you think about traditional Japanese kimono, the collar is very low. Western shirts, ultimately Western dress, has high collars. I don't have mine tied up with a tie, but they would have. So that becomes a new kind of imported fashion. Modernity travels through Japan and changes it much the way modernity changes the West. But it's always tinged with the notion of imports from the West and the adoption of Western ideas, although there are also local versions that play out. And I certainly wouldn't want to say all of the idea of modernity comes from the West. Although I think my mother would have been happy to have one of these dresses in the 1920s. Western styles of art, Cubism, Fauvism, etc., come into Japan as well. Back to disasters. 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake. The earthquake probably killed about 500 people, and the fires afterwards about 12,000. Terrible event in many ways. Japanese militarism develops, and the 15-year war, which America is only involved in the last 5 years of it, as Japan moves across the continent and expands greatly, and then ultimately loses the war. The disasters of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs bring the war to a close. One might argue that it was coming to a close in any case. America occupies Japan. Western forces occupy Japan for 7 years until 1952. And I see that as the start of new ideas of aesthetic. The notion of cuteness. Hello Kitty with her sense of the whole world at her feet. Hello Kitty played out in its weirdest kinds of incarnations. This cuteness pervades Japanese culture from the late 50s into the current time. It has a certain sexiness attached to it, but it's certainly a factor in contemporary Japan. It plays out in the Japanese love of cute robots, cute machines, as well as cute people. Moving on through history, the Shinkansen bullet trains were built for the Tokyo Olympics in 1964. 71, the Nixon shock. The yen had been set at 360 yen to the dollar for decades. It floated by the time I got to Japan in 1976, it was 300 yen to the dollar. Now, of course, it's 100 and some, 100 and a few. Iki, that sense of style, comes back, now called naoi, and that's based on the English word now. Nowish girls from the 90s might have been ganguro, cancer black, over tanned girls imitating surfer culture or some version thereof. You might see artists like Morimura Yasumasa imitating Marilyn Monroe as part of a series of portraits that he did of himself as both American or Western and Japanese celebrities. So here he's posed as Marilyn, same artist, photograph of himself posed as Michael Jackson. Everything up to the minute. It can include both what we would think of as modern, but also traditional things played out. So traditional fabrics reused for modern dresses, traditional stories retold as television dramas, and that modernity even taking over the world in things like the morning drama Oshin that became a worldwide sensation. 92, the economic bubble bursts. And we replaced the growing city with growing homelessness. The Hanshin earthquake in Kobe in 1995. The Aum Shinrikyo religious fanatic attack on the Tokyo subway in 96. Or fast forward 15 years to the Tohoku triple disaster of 2011. Meanwhile, Japan is becoming more and more international, more and more multicultural. So we have Japanese architects building the most up-to-date stadiums for the World Cup. Well, first for the Tokyo Olympics of 64, this stadium built by Hiroshi Hara for the World Cup of 2002. And it looks like a spaceship that landed in the middle of Sapporo. It has an indoor natural grass field. How do they do that? Does the roof open? No. The field, the whole grass playing field is on an air cushion device that picks it up a centimeter off the ground, and they can literally, 5 men can push it outside the building where it sits and gets natural sunlight and rain most of the time. And then they put it up on the air cushion and push it back into the building when there's an event. At the same time, Japan invites artists from around the world. This is Christo in his parasols, set up in Japan in 2006. Artists who depict the multicultural, multiple aspects of Japan. Here, McDonald's invades Japan, and you see the traditionally dressed Japanese woman eating a hamburger, where the modern Japanese woman in her gangster-like tattoos and red hair is eating traditional Japanese food. Well, sort of traditional Japanese food. It's ramen, Chinese noodles imported to Japan and made Japanese in the early the 20th century. So that's the survey of Japanese aesthetic ideas. I'd be happy to talk about them some more and answer. I'm sure there are some questions that have come up. And then we'll take a little break and see how we can apply these to the Japanese living environment and living spaces.
Yeah, okay, Frank. No one's been typing, so if there's any question about the Q&A, I encourage you to start typing in. The Q&A feature is probably down about the middle bottom of your screen. Meantime, Frank, I'm going to lead off here, a little sample of the kind of questions this raises. Back in the Koke humor garden, way down in, I think it's Kagoshima or someplace down in the bottom of Kyushu. That's a garden I'd love to see. You mentioned that it had also several features of the Tokaido Road featured. And as tell me, could you explore more of the difference between a humorous reference there versus the more honorific reference that the Japanese word is fuje? That's the garden, and which kind of loosely would translate, I guess, to recreating famous scenes from places such as the Tokaido or, the Edo area, such as Fuji, or scenes from literature or poetry and so forth?
They're kind of parallel. There's a lot of similarity between the two ideas. So you could look at this garden as a kind of homage to the Tokaido, but it's also kind of funny in the sense that you don't expect to see Mount Fuji in Kumamoto, for example. You might expect to see it in Edo, but here I think there's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek going on.
Would you compare that the way to sometimes when, say, a jazz band is playing a number and all of a sudden you're hearing some kind of Santa Claus jingle in the middle of it? you know, it's in the same key and they just slip it in there. Kind of a little surprise.
Yep, exactly the same kind of thing. And this whole idea of both mitate, where you're telling one story, but you're actually telling another story.
Wait, is that analogous to the way the medieval French might criticize the monarchy by setting a tale in Spain and then let it rip, you know?
That's part of it. That's certainly a part of it. In other words, it's not the kind of openly political satire that Saturday Night Live does. It's
Veiled.
not that imitating. I mean, if this same painter might have painted paintings of Dharma, the monk who brought Zen to China and who is honored in Japan as a result. In fact, I don't have one, but I could show you images of that. Dharma has some humor, a lot of humor associated with him in any case. But here you're showing a story of Dharma, but played out with a different actor.
Cute. One of our participants, Wendy, had another question about the garden in Kagoshima. Wendy, you're on.
Okay, sorry, I'm giggling. See, you see in this, what I saw that I thought was hilarious before I noticed the Fuji thing was, you see the big boulders across the water in the back there? You can't cross, they're not a bridge. You can't cross the water on those boulders as you could in other Japanese stone boulder crossings. Is that part of the humor? It's sort of like, you're stuck.
You're stuck, yep.
It's not a crossing. Is that part of it?
That kind of, yes, there are those kinds of things. Or things like these stepping stones.
Yeah, go nowhere.
That go nowhere.
Yeah.
I think the designer of this garden, and this is the kind of garden where the warlord has a castle. And these are warlords who never go to war. They have to maintain an army. They have to have a castle, but they basically have a lot of spare time to sit around and think of crazy things to do. So almost every one of the warlords builds a garden as part of the castle compound. And each of those gardens, they're competing with one another to make them different. So sometimes that plays out in very humorous ways. Sometimes it's competition in more serious ways, and so forth.
We need to readopt that. Humorous warlords around the world. I'm for that. Thank you.
Frank, I'm struck. Could you compare that to the, what would this be? The, when the British Empire was at its peak, they would build these elaborate stroll gardens. And this, of course, is a stroll garden we're looking at here as well, with what they call follies and clever references to past times, or be they jokes or a more serious homage. You'd have a Greek temple, a grotto, so forth. I think it's the same impulse.
I think it's the same. I think it's a kind of impulse, yes. And you'll note that the English don't build gardens that make fun of King Arthur and Camelot. But they're happy to build gardens that incorporate a little Greek pavilion or a little Roman temple or a little French chateau or whatever. Or even a Chinese building, as they understood a Chinese building. They didn't do much with Japanese buildings until after the 1860s, but certainly had Chinese imitations. And it's the same, it's largely the same impulse. So some of the gardens like this one happens, well, let's put it this in general terms. One of my Japanese colleagues calls these theme parks. So the theme of this theme park is the Tokaido Road. So it's got a Mount Fuji, it's got a Pine Beach, it's got a bridge like the Gojo Bridge in Kyoto where the road ends. Another garden, the theme might be the Analects of Confucius, and they're figuring out how to build references into the garden to very serious Chinese literature. There's another one in Tokyo. Koishikawa Korakuen has a theme of Japanese poetry, where it's picked out scenes like the 8-planked bridge through the irises, which is picked up in a lot of Western Japanese gardens. For example, there's one in Portland. So it's that kind of homage, but sometimes it plays out as humor as well. There's one in Tokyo where the Kiyosumi Koen, where the original theme was the provinces of Japan, and then the garden is bought by a very wealthy businessman in the early Meiji period, and he decides to put a rock from each province in each province of his garden. So he collects huge stones from all over Japan and labels them in each part of his garden. That's kind of the expression of that Makoto truth. He really wants it to have a piece of Issei or a piece of Izumo or a piece of Kagoshima or whatever actually in the garden.
Oh, yeah. Now, folks are queuing up here, Frank. So I think I'll just put them on, keep them coming. Barbara, here you come. Let me see. Barbara, are you unmuted? Hold on. Find her. There she is. Okay, Barbara, go ahead and unmute yourself. Okay, I don't know. So Barbara's asking, can you discuss more of, before we put Barbara's question up there, I know Barbara. She's a art history teacher out of Berkeley, California, and she takes people, her last trip, she took people to Iran to explore the art of, from Persia on to the present and so forth. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Just trying to get her to unmute here. And Barbara, come back if you're not around. Well, we'll skip over, we'll get back to her. And let's see. Diane asks, besides the tale of Genji, what are the major philosophical works behind these aesthetic periods. So Diane, I'm going to try and put you on.
Um, the literary basis for all this is long and complicated. That's actually in some ways a whole other lecture. And one difference between Japan, Asia in general, and the West is that there's no, well, it's true in the West as well, there's no aesthetics for a long time. There's poetics and there's theory of painting, but there's no overarching concept of beauty until in Japan that really develops in the 19th century under the influence of the West. So it's not that there are philosophical works about these concepts, except in the limited sense of one field, one field, one field. So for example, we can go back to Fujiwara Teika's preface to the first imperial anthology of poems called the Kokinshu. And in that preface, he lays out a lot of the rules for what was collected. It's a collection of poems from many different poets up to his time. But so he lays out the rules of, well, we're going to organize this by seasons, and we're going to organize parts of it by love poems, and we're going to collect the death poems together and that sort of thing. But he also lays out some ideas for what is beautiful in a poem, what makes a poem attractive. And included in that is a sense of reference, that it should refer to other things in the tradition, refer to other parts of its history, notions that it should, even if it's not a poem about spring, it should have some sense of season in it. And when we get, and of course, almost 500 years later, when we get to the development of basho and haikai, later haiku, that's going to become an absolute requirement. You can't have a good haiku without a seasonal word. And to the extent that it won't even be recognized as a haiku unless it has some seasonal reference in it. What I didn't talk about here is that in addition to the serious traditions of waka poetry, which goes back, of course, 1,500 years, haiku or haikai, later haiku poetry, which goes back 500 years anyway. We also have, particularly developing in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, other poetic traditions. Kyoka, crazy poems, are waka poems that have been turned into jokes, that have been parodied to make them funny. In haiku, we have the senryu tradition, where those poems that might have been a little bit funny for basho, then we take the same form and write really funny poems and call them senryu. My favorite, just as an example, my favorite haiku is probably Nanohana ya Tsuki wa Higashi ni Hiwa nishi ni. The yellow flowers, and it's a very specific yellow flower that blooms in the 4th month of the lunar calendar. Nano Hanaya, Tsuki wa higashi ni, hi wa nishi ni. The yellow flowers, the sun, the moon in the east, the sun in the west. So it tells you in the poem what time it is. It's sunset. What day of the month it is? It must be the 15th of the month. What's the weather like? It's got to be clear. It's probably a little chilly because it's the fourth lunar month. What is the shape of the moon? It's got to be full round because it's in the east when the sun is in the west. So we have this very complicated picture laid out in 17 syllables. My comparison poem for Senryu translates to something like, the Western meal, how boring. All the plates are round. So they both have some humor, but the Senryu is much more open, overt humor. There are a lot of Senryu that I can't really translate in mixed company. And then there's a third version that takes Chinese poetry and makes it funny. And the Kyoshi tradition. So lots of different ways that humor plays itself out.
In that last case, is that analogous to, say, the British comedians, the Monty Python troupe poking fun at the French, or?
Oh, I think it's also Oscar Wilde or who's the American poet? I never saw a purple cow. I never hope to see one. Ogden Nash.
Yeah. Burma shave.
Mostly funny poetry.
Yeah, delightful. We still have quite a queue here, and Frank, you seem to be making the case that different aesthetics evolved independently of one another in more narrow fields. And you made a remark that it wasn't until outsiders came and in relation to their, essentially their hosts in Japan said, hey, you guys you're not diverse, you're Japanese, we're Europeans or something. And you guys have a different aesthetic, was it the viewpoint of the third part of the outsider that made people, rather than focus on their diversity, focus on their commonality?
Oh, that too is a complicated question. I would say on the one hand, Japan has always had this outside versus inside thing. If you go back to the early parts of the history, the outside is China and the inside is Japan. And never mind that Korea is usually in between China and Japan. But so there's often a sense of us versus them, identifying, if you go back to the Heian period, identifying a robe as being a Chinese robe as opposed to a Japanese costume. But I think that, well, and of course, when the Westerners come in, there's the same distinction drawn. And then over the period between the first appearance of the Westerners in the 16th century, and then Japan closes off from the West. Not completely, never completely stops having contact, but to large measure closed off. And a Japanese sense of beauty grows back up again. a Japanese sense of a lot of things develops. Then in the 19th century, the Westerners come back. And at that point, the Japanese government, the Meiji government, sees that the Western concept of nation has a lot to do with national identity. That the British coming to Japan are identifying themselves differently from the Americans coming from Japan to Japan, who are different from the French coming to Japan, who are different from the Iranians coming to Japan, and all these people from all these different countries. And the government quite literally sits down and decides it has to create a Japanese identity. And that it cuts away a lot of the diversity that we know exists within Japan to emphasize unity and to emphasize Japan as a single ethnic unit and a single nation. It tries to unify the language. It tries to unify the dress of people from the whole country. A whole lot of things go on in that unification process. And that very much still affects the way Japanese approach the world today. Either you're buying into that unity or you're reacting against it. Because in fact, there is a lot of diversity within Japan. As I always say, if there were no ethnic diversity or diversity within Japan, you wouldn't need 17 different TV stations in Tokyo. But in fact, there are 17 different TV stations because there are people who like to watch anime, and there are people who like to watch samurai dramas, and there are people who like to watch documentaries, and there are all kinds of people, even within Japan. So that there is diversity within that illusion of unity. Does that answer? I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, Diane, I hope so too. Frank, you told us that your wife, in fact, was a professor of Asian literature or Japanese literature. Maybe to properly answer Diane's question of what are the major philosophical works behind these aesthetic periods, we might have to have the two of you back again.
Well, Linda gives good lectures too. One of the interesting things about this kind of lecture is that she and I will pass the text back and forth, and both of us look at it. And while she probably would have different things to say about the tale of Genji or the idea of gaudy beauty, we're in basic agreement about most of that stuff. Yeah, she's particularly involved with literature, but she also teaches courses on general introductions to Japan. One of my favorite things that she teaches that unfortunately we can't do very well over the internet is she does a food course that's just wonderful, but it would just leave everybody hungry.
We got to leave room for your presentation, but you're making me laugh because there I was in Japan and my host family nearly panicked, and they said, no, Peter. I was eating a bowl of ramen. They said, no, you're eating it Chinese style. They showed me the proper way. It was very sweet. Well,
it's interesting that China, Korea, and Japan each have their own eating styles. And Koreans leave the bowl on the table all the time. Japanese pick the bowl up all the time. The Japanese say the Koreans eat like dogs because they don't pick up the bowl. And the Koreans say the Japanese eat like beggars because they don't put it down.
Enough said. Well, as a follow-on, in Kyoto, I was absentmindedly reading the subway map while I was plucking up the last of the rice grains with my chopsticks, and this old fellow walks over and tells me how impressed he was, and proceeds to take me to my next location, and then we arrange a meeting where I get to meet a friend of his the following day, and it just he had a life story behind that, and he was looking for someone to express his gratitude towards, and it was all just enlivened by the fact that I had this facility. So remarkable. You'd never get that kind of compliment at McDonald's for proper use of the knife and fork.
Right.
All righty, so Barbara's figured out how to unmute herself. To all of you, I'll be calling on in turn from Q&A. Keep your eye on the bottom left corner of your screen, and hold on there, Barbara. There's a microphone, like a radio microphone icon there that usually says mute or something like that, or unmute, and I'll be asking you to unmute by pushing a button. And if you see a red, oh, it's at the top. Okay.
Yeah, it says view options.
One other hint, and people may not know this about Zoom, but if you're muted and you can be unmuted, if you just press the space bar, now for me it'll move my screen, but if you press the space bar, it'll temporarily unmute you.
Yeah. Okay. So Barbara, do you want to ask your question and take it from here?
Yes. I've been enjoying your presentation very much. Thank you so much.
1958.
Can you hear me? We have your narrative here, so.
Philadelphia.
Hold on there, Barbara.
New garden. Although it was a site, it's on a site that has had.
Okay, that was Frank, probably hit the wrong key.
That's all right.
Barbara, proceed.
Okay.
Japanese gardens since literally the first Japanese
Still getting his narrative.
Built for the 1876.
You can always just read from my question, Peter, if that's the option there.
Yeah, I don't know why we're getting some kind of a replay. Well,
Yeah.
Frank, Barbara asked a question here, and she said, "Can you discuss more of teacup design and those from Korea, which I have heard was highly influential at that time?" So the influence of Korean potters on the Japanese
Especially
art.
our contemporary potters who have used a lot of Korean-based forms and the spontaneity of those Korean-based forms. So not as much Japanese, but more Korean in terms of tea ceremony, as I understand it.
That's another course I teach. So there's actually a lot to be said about tea cup or tea bowl forms. That Chanoyu, the formal practice of tea in Japan, starts, of course, with imports from China and grows popular in the 12th and 13th, even into the 14th and 15th centuries, with among the warrior elite who practice it with Chinese tea bowls, Chinese pottery that's being imported. And so it's very expensive and it's very elite. History of those Chinese bowls, well, the Chinese aesthetic of them has a lot to do with symmetry there through almost the entire perfection, if you will. That they want a completely round, completely symmetrical, completely smooth kind of bowl. And if I had the proper PowerPoint up, I would show you a Chinese celadon bowl from the Song Dynasty that was kind of perfect in its smoothness and perfection and symmetry. Koreans and Japanese both took those Chinese bowls and transformed them. In Japan, as tea culture develops under a series of three tea masters, Murata Shuko, Takenojo, and then Senno Rikyu, they begin to use not just the Chinese tea bowl. And if you practice tea today, you can still use a Chinese tea bowl. You can still, in fact, there are special ceremonies for using Chinese tea bowls. But Jo and Rikyu began to use Korean bowls that were made as ordinary people's rice bowls. One of the famous stories is that Rikyu met a Korean fisherman in Sakai and saw the guy eating his rice from a really misshapen, odd bowl. And then Rikyu offers the guy an immense amount of money for his rice bowl, which Rikyu then turned into a tea bowl. And it's now in the Omote Senkei family collection. So we know the story at some level is true because the fisherman's tea bowl is still there. So Rikyu and company start this aesthetic not of the expensive, perfect imported bowl, but the local, loose, natural bowl. It's happening at the same time that they're transforming the tea room from a very structured, elegant space into a space based on, among other things, Korean woodsheds and farmhouses that are kind of asymmetrical and small, intimate, but very natural spaces. So this idea of the wabi aesthetic, things that are very natural in appearance, that are very, where the transitions may be smooth, but they're not all smoothed out. So that the ultimate shape of the finest tea bowls in Japan is not that perfectly symmetrical, perfectly round, perfectly smooth Chinese shape, but has waves along the top rim, indentations in the sides, unevenly applied glaze that might even have holes in it or cracks in it. And the notion that the perfect tea bowl is not perfected, but imperfected. If I can explain wabi tea bowls that way. And then sabi is kind of the other side of that, where it's not just a new tea bowl that's beautiful, it's an old tea bowl that's beautiful. It's one that's got, in an ideal circumstance, you're drinking tea from a bowl that someone, some famous tea master, well, I suppose the ultimate is if you drink a tea bowl, if you drink tea from a bowl that Rikyu used 500 years ago, that's about as high up as you can get in the tea world. And that bowl might have a lot of tea stains, but that's okay because it means it's been drunk from by a lot of tea people. So it has a history and a patina of history. So those are the wabi and the sabi ideas that some people put together into wabi sabi, but I think of them as two separate but linked concepts.
Thank you. That was great.
Okay. Now, Hiromi, who's actually our handler over at the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership, she says, "Hi, this is not a question, but Professor Chance's webinar class is very icky, and he is Japanese too. I'm enjoying very much."
Thank you. I try. It's very interesting when I talk about cultural appropriation with my students and realize that I'm guilty of it all the time. So it's a complex issue, but I try not to appropriate things that I don't have at least some pretty clear understanding of.
Yeah, you're live, Hiromi.
Oh, hi. No, I'm very much enjoying it. Feels like going back to my Japanese school classes and relearning as adult. I'm very much enjoying. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I know I think we've met at a couple of events before.
No, I don't think I met yet, but you know, I would love to in person, definitely.
If we ever get rid of this pandemic thing.
Yes, yes, definitely. And I would like to see your garden in a tea house also.
Well, we will certainly host you here in Philadelphia whenever we can.
Yes, thank you very much.
All right, as soon as they get that bullet train from New York City to Philadelphia, it's be easy.
Yes.
Okay. Maggie has a question to ask. I don't know. Where's Maggie's microphone? Uh-oh, Maggie, your older version of Zoom isn't going to cut the mustard. But I have another way to get you on. Okay, Maggie, you should be live any second now. Want to ask your question? It's about the old cherry tree.
This old cherry tree.
Oh, hold on. Let's see. Ask her to unmute. Okay, well, I'll read it. Maggie, I think you just had to hit your space bar or click something. So Maggie asks, I have heard, oh, by the way, Maggie's an arborist. So I have heard about the 1,000-year-old cherry tree that is venerated. Can you offer some understanding of the value of nature? The cherry tree, which does not appear to be in a formal garden, this one she's talking about, and the why in the way this tree has been cared for over the 1,000 years.
Actually, there again, if I had a different PowerPoint up, I could show you. There are two sister trees in Kyoto. One is in the middle of Maruyama Park, which is a public park. Originally was the grounds of a Shinto shrine near the Gion section. The other one is way across town in the grounds of Tenryuji Buddhist temple on the other side of town. And they are both said to have been planted in the Heian period. We're not sure exactly when, but they they are said to be 1,000 years old. They've both been cared for and loved and taken care of for that whole time. Thought of as sisters. And again, one of the differences in religion in Japan is that where we think of religions as being sort of unitary and essentialist, we don't think you can be a Christian and a Muslim at the same time, even though from an outside viewpoint, they're worshiping the same God. But in Japan, the sense, for the most part, that whether you're Buddhist or Shinto, you're not Buddhist or Shinto. You may be doing something Buddhist at the moment or doing something Shinto at the moment, but you can be both at the same time. And in fact, most people are. So the idea that there are two trees, one in a Shinto shrine and one in a Buddhist temple, is not, shall we say, religiously problematic at all. The fact that they've both been taken care of, they both have posts holding up the branches so that they don't fall down under the weight of too many flowers in the spring, is part of the whole veneration of the environment. And in particular, I think the veneration of the cherry tree. Cherries are a symbol taken up by particularly the warrior culture of the 13th century onward, because the cherry blossom opens and opens quickly, not necessarily overnight, but you can see the buds, but when it opens all the way, and then it stays for a week or two, and then it falls. And that's likened to the spirit of the samurai, the warrior who blossoms on the battlefield and then may fall, and who doesn't want to be like a rose and hang on and hang on and hang on and hang on as a flower for a long, long period of time, but is willing to blossom and disappear. So I don't know if that completely answers your question about cherry trees, but that's where I'd go with it. Cherries are beloved in Japan.
Thank you. I'm not sure that the relevance of my question to what you were just talking about style, but I was just wanting you to expand on that sort of aspect of things being cared for over generations, which is, American culture doesn't know how to do that, and also just how much meaning there is in the value of caring for nature that seems to have permeated the culture for thousands of years, which you mentioned earlier on.
Second part of my talk.
Okay, thank you.
Spoiler alert. Now you're muted, Peter.
Okay, I think Maggie and Frank are hinting at a discussion that North Americans might understand as the conflict between the Thoreauvians and the Jeffersonians, which is playing out to this very day in politics. Maggie's tree brings to mind a story I might appropriate from our teacher, Dennis, who was is a noted local horticulture professional, a tree pruning specialist, and our teacher. And he describes while he was doing an apprenticeship with a leading bonsai family in Japan, at a customer's house of the bonsai stylist, they're having lunch, and the host comes up to him and asks him, gestures to the persimmon tree that they're sitting under and says, "You know the essence of this tree?" And our teacher sort of, was obviously caught off guard. It's kind of scrambling. Well, let's see. It's kind of pretty, whatever. He's looking for what is the essence that could describe it. And he gives her some kind of answer, like, nice branch ramification or whatever. And she goes, no, you don't get it. He said, think about this tree. How many thousands of travelers on the Tokaido over years and years and years have stopped to have lunch under this tree? It's very clear that she venerated that tree the way Riku venerated that fisherman's rice bowl. A beautiful insight into the valuing nature, although I am going to just interject one more comment. Flying into Japan, I've never seen so many rivers behind dams. So let's not get carried away here. That's a highly developed country.
Let me throw out one more tree-related story. This brings me back to Sendo Rikyu, who was training his grandson in tea. And Rikyu said, go clean up the garden. We have a tea ceremony group coming today. Go clean up the garden. And so his grandson Sotan goes out and cleans the garden, rakes up every leaf, makes everything absolutely pristine and beautiful, and it's all perfect. And Rikyu looks out of the tea room and shakes his head. And his grandson looks at him, what have I done wrong? Rikyu reaches up to the maple tree, shakes it. A few crimson leaves come falling down, and Rikyu says, now it's ready.
Beautiful, Frank. Are we at break time here? With the halfway mark?
I think we're at break time.
Okay, that's it for Q&A for now. 10-minute break?
That's plenty for me.
Okay.
Just long enough to walk across the room and back.
There you go.
Maybe I'll go get some more tea.
Very good. Okay. Well, roll them.
Okay, let me find Zoom here just for a second. There we go.
Welcome back, everybody. I hope you're all comfy and settled in for the last majority of an hour with Frank Chance. And Frank, take it away.
Okay, well, that first part of the canned lecture that's been reworked and worked many times over many years. The rest of this is much fresher stuff that I'm just developing now. So I want to take those Japanese aesthetic concepts and think about how we apply them to the living environment, the lived environment, if you will. So we're going to zoom in on them, little visual metaphor there. So if we think about how that fits into the real world of both Japan and ways we might try to apply that stuff in our own lives. It doesn't mean we have to live in Japan to do that. Not, as Jerry Seinfeld might say, not that there's anything wrong with that. living in Japan is wonderful if you can do it, but you can also live in other parts of the world and think about this kind of ideal Japanese space or ideal Japanese relationship to the world that I want to look at. But of course, Japanese buildings and Japanese gardens were created for the Japanese environment, and the Japanese lifestyle was created for those kind of buildings and for that kind of space that one can live in, both built and landscape space. So we might think about doing that in a very Japanese style space. This is Shofuso, the Japanese house and garden in Philadelphia. But it's a space that visitors frequently will come to this space and say, I feel like I'm back in Japan. It's close to the Japanese environment. It's temperate climate. It's a similar kind of hot, moist summer, cool, drier winter, like Japan. And so the building is fairly compatible with that. But of course, there are environments that it wouldn't be compatible with. If you think about the desert or the tropics, I will let my West Coast friends like Peter talk about how to adapt Japanese gardening to the desert. But I can say a few things about adapting it to the tropics. This spread out on the screen in front of you is Shikina-en, a very Japanese garden in a semi-tropical environment. This is in Okinawa, and it was, so it's far to the south, so far south that it goes off the screen down in the bottom, in Naha in Okinawa. This is a royal garden. We could think of it as a warlord garden or a parallel to those warlord gardens of the 18th century in the mainland of Japan. But it's in a very different kind of climate on a relatively small island in warm water. So with lots of warm rain, too warm to grow a lot of pine trees, for example. Too wet to grow a lot of pine trees, too, in some ways. Royal in the sense that this was built for the castle, if you want to call it that, palace complex of the kings of the Ryukyu Islands in Naha. But it's built like a Japanese garden. It's a time when those kings were linked up with the warlords of Kagoshima and southern Japan, and were very much trying to be a part of or to respond to Japanese ideas. So it's a typical Kaiushiki strolling garden built around a pond, even though it's, I don't think has a single pine tree in it, which would be very rare in mainland Japan. It does have some tamamono, bubble pruned azaleas, although I understand they're really hard to keep healthy in that environment. You'll also notice that the rock that they're using to make the bridges and the pathways is lava, a volcanic rock, not the kind of thing you would be likely to use in mainland Japan. So it's adapting the local material, adapting the local plants, and adapting the local building style. This modern structure off in the corner looks like it could be Japanese, although the red tile roof is a marker of Okinawanness, if you will. But the other buildings on the property are very open. Not that Japanese buildings aren't typically open as well, but quite different in configuration from most Japanese structures. You also, I don't know if you can actually see it in these slides, but it has to work with a lot of local things. The little white spots along the path here are actually little crabs that come up out of the ocean and infest this garden on a regular basis. They have to fight hard to not be overrun by algae in the pond. But they do a pretty good job of it. It's an interesting kind of Japanese garden in a not traditionally Japanese environment. You can also see that the buildings like this pavilion have a little more Chinese flavor than the pavilions in most Japanese gardens of the 18th or early 19th century. So just as an example of how you can adapt physically Japanese garden space to a different environment. One thing they're very proud of there is, of course, they have lots and lots of these sago palms, which are very hard to keep growing in particularly the northern half of the main islands of Japan, but that are native to Okinawa, and so very easy to grow there. A parallel situation we might think of in the States would be the gardens at the Morikami in Boca Raton, Florida, where again they have to deal with a not very Japanese environment. It's semi-tropical, quite warm all through the winter, rainy, wet, and difficult. And yet they manage, at least there they managed to have a few pine trees and other things that really remind us of Japanese gardens. But you can also see that they have trouble keeping some of their plants alive. Let me go back to that for a moment. Even though the basic design, again, is a Kaiushiki strolling garden. But the plants they've had to use are, generally speaking, quite different from the ones you would see in Japan. And one of the most striking things about this garden is not the waterfalls or the lanterns, but the koi, which, because they have a 12-month per year growing season, the koi in the front of that is probably this big around. And they grow to what feels like the size of tuna. They're just huge. And even the ones that look small here would be large in anybody else's koi pond, I think. And yes, those are snapping turtles that they're floating around with. And they can't keep small koi in their pond because the alligators get them. But the alligators can't eat the really big ones, or don't eat the really big ones. Anyway, that's just a sense of how an unusual environment or different environment can affect the whole process. I wanted to bring in what is kind of maybe the best of the best. This is Katsura Rikyu, in some ways the most Sukiya of the Sukiya gardens and complexes, with both a shoin and half a dozen structures in the garden, most of them tea houses, although one little Buddhist structure, as well. Built in the early 17th century by two princes of the royal family. Design advice from a tea master that they worked closely with. A central palace structure, showing, actually a sukiya showing, if you want to be technical about it. Very open. All of those white spaces on this level are all screens that can be opened up, and the rooms opened to join the garden. And then smaller buildings, tea houses, and other structures around the garden, so that the building, the garden, and the tea houses are all a linked unit in many, many ways. Everything from the little shokate, really a waiting room for the other tea houses. But every element of this, though done with humble materials, it can be extremely elegant and most beautifully built. The tea houses themselves, by the way, the pine tree here is a replacement. When the garden was built, there was a dramatic pine tree there. It died about 175 years ago. And when it died, they were able to replace it immediately because they had its successor growing off in a corner of the garden. Just as now the successor for this tree is growing off in the corner of the garden. And this little 17-acre garden only has, I think, 50 full-time employees taking care of it. So it's well manicured. The tea houses themselves range from very humble, almost so-on style, to these sukiya style structures that have painted walls and, of course, earthen walls in the tea room itself. But if you go to the other rooms around it, views out onto the pond, beautiful papers used on the walls, or in some cases, paintings, walls that incorporate gold and silver, as well as views out into nature. And I think the key to this building is the fact that the natural exterior, to the extent that this garden is natural, every tree is placed and planted, every twig practically is designed. It's a place where, as we talked about the leaves falling before, here the leaves fall in the right places. They're so well trained that it fits into its natural world kind of perfectly. And I think that's what we mean by the Japanese style living environment. That's the ideal. We may not always be able to live up to the ideal, but it would always be nice to. It turns on these open structures whose space flows from a room to a veranda to a garden to a pond, and without any clear break along the way. And similarly, one's life should flow that way. But at the same time, when I said before, cleanliness is godliness. So of course you remove your shoes when you go inside and replace them with slippers. Of course you take those slippers off and put on another pair when you go into the bathroom, the restroom. Another aspect of this is that you heat people, not spaces. because the spaces are so open, they're hard to build central heating for. So instead you invent things like the kotatsu that allows you to go through the winter months with your feet and legs warm without having to heat the room to 75 degrees to be comfortable. So you're conscious of the environment, you're interacting with the environment, you're not trying to compete with the natural environment that's around you, which seems to be the Western attitude towards keeping the cold out in the winter and the hot out in the summer, and kind of fighting against the environment rather than working with it. A space like Shofuso has a large veranda on the south side, so that in the summer, the roof keeps that whole space shaded. Wind can blow through that space, narrows down to blow through the doors. Venturi effect causes that breeze to cool down by 3 to 5 degrees as it goes into the rooms. Natural air conditioning. And by contrast, in the winter, the sun is lower in the sky, the veranda is in sunlight, the wood warms up, and I have sat on this veranda in my shirt sleeves, looking at snow in the garden that's not melting and being perfectly comfortable. So it gives you a contact with the natural world that is just not available in a Western style living space. Another way that plays out, for example, in Japan is recycling. When I lived in Kyoto for 6 months in 2016, we had 7, this is I think only 6. We actually had 7 different recycling bins. One for colored glass, one for white glass, one for plastic of this kind, one for plastic of that kind, one for electronics, and if you tried to do that in Philadelphia, people rebel against you. If you try, we tried in Philadelphia to have 2 divisions of recycling, paper and glass, plastic, everything else. It was too complicated, people couldn't do it. After a couple of years, they gave up and made it a single stream recycling, which we all suspect just goes into the garbage, but that's another story. In Japan, you have this very sort of complex kind of recycling that's worked out and trash collection. And trust me, if I took the papers out on the day when the glass was going to be picked up, my neighbor would stop me and tell me I had the wrong day. They would do it in a kind manner, but they would do it. So that whole relationship with the environment plays out that way. Let me take this one step farther and talk about how it works on the personal level. Once you've got the sense that you and the environment must interact and not compete, when there's a pandemic, you just wear a mask. It's the right thing to do. Never mind that this illustration comes from a horror story about wearing masks. People just wear masks. Do they get 100% compliance with mask rules? No. But 90% works pretty well to keep the virus down. To let you know how they've done, Japan has been very worried lately. There's a resurgence of the virus. They now have almost 1,700 people who have died in Japan from COVID. That's 1,700. There are American cities half the size of Philadelphia where we've had more deaths than that. Wash your hands. This is traditional hand washing before you go into a shrine. Nonetheless, once the pandemic hit in Japan, I saw Japanese news shows, children's shows, housewife shows on television every day telling you how to wash your hands, explaining that you need to sing happy birthday while you wash the soap on your hands. And people do it. Or once they figured out that the problem had to do with the three mitsu, the san mitsu, or the mitsu no mitsu, as it were, it's been translated into English as the three C's: closed spaces, crowded places, and close contact. And if you can avoid all three of those, you're not very likely to catch COVID. And if you go to one of these places where you've got all three, you're pretty likely to get it. Combine that with good contact tracing, even though they haven't tested as much as they might have. And Japan has had a pretty good, successful time controlling the virus. Now, every day on the national news, they show you the numbers for every prefecture and major city in Japan, who's got new cases, how many new cases they have, how many people are in the hospital, how many people have died. Literally tracked every day on a nationwide basis. All of that comes down to a couple of things that play out in interpersonal relations that are the result of a whole combination of factors coming together to make these things a part of Japanese behavior. And yes, it's ideal behavior. Everybody doesn't always have either omotenashi or omoyari. But in an ideal world, they do. And I think most Japanese people strive to keep these things up and going in their lives. Again, it's like wabi and sabi. They're linked but different concepts. Omotenashi is the sense of hospitality, is how it's usually translated. That you're doing things for people. I remember going into meetings in Japanese companies where we might be getting a briefing from some Japanese executive or government official. And partway through the meeting, a young lady comes in, usually it's a young lady, sometimes a young man, comes in and brings everyone in the room a drink. It might be tea, it might be coffee, it might be orange juice, depends on a little bit on the weather. There's a tendency in the meetings I was in, because I was often with an American group, that they would bring in coffee because they assume that Americans like coffee. So omotenashi means providing everyone, or providing your guests with what they need. Omote is motsu, to carry. Nasu is to arrange or to develop. So to arrange things to carry in. In those meetings, if I went to the same place for another meeting, the tea server often would notice that I didn't drink my coffee, because I don't drink coffee. And then and only then would they ask me if I wanted tea. It's a sense that very much we talk about in tea practice. I don't know why that just jumped, but it did. It's something we talk about in tea practice. It's something we try to actively practice as part of tea ritual, to provide things for the person. Well, Moriarty is similar but a little different. It has a more personal context. It's often in the context of a family. So here you see a young father thinking about what his daughter might need. Young wife thinking about what her husband wants when he comes home from work. Uh, Maybe these days, husband thinking about what his wife wants when she comes home from work. It's putting your attention on the other person. I think it grows out of the Buddhist sense of the interconnectedness of things, of what my philosophical teachers would call with fancy words codependent origination. The notion that you don't have light without darkness, you don't have heat without cold, you don't have you without me. We cause each other to come into existence. And as such, I need to be concerned about your needs, and I hope you're concerned about mine, but basically I need to be concerned about your needs first. Keeping that idea of our relationship primary, and your needs coming in many ways before mine. Does this mean there are no selfish people in Japan? Huh! Don't make me laugh. Of course there are. But there's a tendency, this cultural idea puts the other person first and emphasizes that. Whereas in American culture, we might think of the rugged individual who thinks of themselves first in many, many such situations. My right to be free of wearing a mask trumps your right to be protected from my virus somehow. So that is kind of where I would end up with this discussion of how the aesthetics are worked out in personal lives, just as they're worked out in dealing with natural environment. So we would see that every apartment has a potted plant or a little balcony, or in the ideal world, a tsuboniwa, a small garden. In even the most humble of houses, there's some attempt to bring the natural world in and to relate to it in some way. And of course, if you're fortunate enough to have a beautiful house, you will always in Japan also have a garden, preferably well manicured and taken care of, quite possibly by professional gardeners, but also by your own personal activities taking care of it. So I'm going to stop talking at this point and say that you can ask me questions. I can try to develop any of those ideas further. There were lots of other things I thought about trying to talk about, but either I couldn't figure out how to illustrate them, or they just fell by the wayside. So there are many other buttons you could push if you want me to say something, but hopefully I have provided you with a little omotenashi to move forward with. And we can go back to more questions if there are more questions about any of this stuff.
Yes, there are. And also in the chat box, there's a question, as well as many expressions of gratitude, Frank. So you're
Thank you.
yeah. So Bonnie asked in chat, what are some differences in aesthetics of northern versus southern Japan? How so local environments, how do local environments influence national aesthetics? It's a three-part question. I can read them off one at a time again. How do local environments or movement influence national aesthetics if they do. So first she asks, what are some differences in aesthetics of northern versus southern Japan?
Well, the first thing I would start with is by saying that traditionally in Japan, we don't talk about northern Japan and southern Japan so much as we talk about eastern Japan and western Japan. When we look at a map, we see it as north and south. When they look at the map, they see it as east. It's really east and north versus south and west. Kyoto, which is near the joint between east and west, but on the west side of it, thinks of itself as the cultural capital. And all of these ideas in some ways grew up around Kyoto, Nara, Western Japan, except for the notion maybe of Hade and to some extent Iki, which are more Edo, Tokyo ideas. To put it in a very practical sense, northern, eastern Japanese food is very, they would say karai, but they don't mean spicy, they mean salty. Western Japanese food, Kyoto food, as opposed to Edo food, is much sweeter, much less salty. Kyushu food is more likely to be flavored with sake. Tokyo food with more likely to be flavored with soy sauce. Sendai, or really far northern Japanese food, likely to be flavored with miso or even natto, soybeans. So the foods have different flavors. There's a difference between a Nagoya style obi, which is narrow and stiff, Kyoto style obi, which is wide and soft, an Edo style obi, which is probably more colorful, certainly than the Kyoto obi, and also wider, but the Edo style is going to be wide and soft, where the Nagoya style is narrow and hard. The Kyoto style is kind of in between in terms of width and soft. There are different kinds of cloth associated with different parts of Japan. So in Okinawa, you might find yourself wearing bashofu, bamboo cloth, or not bamboo, banana leaf fibers woven into cloth. In Kyoto, it might be silk. In Kyushu, it might be cotton. In Eastern Japan, it might be any of those, but it could also be linen. And of course, all of those fibers are actually used all over the country, but it's that the best things produced in a given region are all different. So each aspect of the aesthetic world plays out somewhat differently in each part of the country. In terms of, if I put it in terms of garden things, the Kyoto region has a kind of moss called sugigoke, cedar moss, where each little moss plant looks like a little cedar tree. That almost will not, that is very, very difficult to keep alive as far away as Nagoya, let alone Tokyo or Sendai or Hiroshima. It's a very local plant, and it makes the Kyoto garden lush in its moss in ways that the moss is not lush anywhere else. For example, there are regional styles in the way trees are pruned, the particular shapes that trees are pruned into, and of course there are different kinds of plants that are used more in different parts of the country. Well, for example, the sago palms that I showed from the garden in Okinawa, there are a few very elite gardens in Kyoto, for example, that have them, that have maybe 3 or 5 of those palm plants. Nijo Castle has them, Katsura Rikyu has them, Shugakuin Rikyu, another imperial garden, has them. Nishihonganji, I think, has them. And that's about it. Otherwise, you can't give them enough attention to keep them alive or to keep them healthy, even in Kyoto, let alone in Edo or Tokyo. So different things like that. Gardens in Kanazawa or on the back of Japan, to use the pejorative term, the Japan Sea, west coast of Japan. Those gardens are all famous for how beautiful they are in snow, because Kanazawa measures its snow not in centimeters, but in meters per year. Kyoto measures its snow in centimeters per year on a cold year. In a warm year, you get 0 snow. But Kenroku-en in Kanazawa is at its best in the snow, and they have to do special things to keep the trees from breaking under the weight of the snow, special things to keep the stones from suffering too much from freeze and thaw, that you don't have to do in Kyoto, because it just simply doesn't get that cold and it doesn't snow that much. So the aesthetics of every part of Japan play out a little differently, and there is, in fact, a lot of variety within the culture. And of course, one of the joys of traveling in Japan from time immemorial has been going to those other places and enjoying their special things. So you want to eat beef tongue when you go to Sendai. You want to have a pork cutlet when you go to Nagoya. You want to have traditional tea meal like kaiseki when you go to Kyoto. It's not that you can't get a kaiseki in Tokyo or in Sendai, you can, but they're at their best in Kyoto. Even a more modern invention like ramen, noodles. Kyoto ramen is different from Nagoya ramen, is different from Hakata ramen, is different from Sapporo ramen. They're all variations, although they all stem from the same root, but they're played out in different ways. So does that answer all your question? All 3 parts of the question?
Let me see if I can put Bonnie on. Sorry, I'm a little, if she's still around here. Oh, there she is, right here. Bonnie, I'm allowing you to talk. Please,
Thank you so much for your presentation. Oh, I'm going to have a lot of echo. Yeah, that answered my question. And as I mentioned, I also am glad that you brought in the food and the taste part of it too. That's to me important, but what the local foods are and how that affects, and local plants, how that affects aesthetics. I like the story about the Kyoto moss too. So thank you. That does answer.
Okay.
Let's see. And back to Q&A. Barbara has another question. She asked, can you tell me more about the famous moss garden, Saihoji? How was moss replaced or encouraged to grow continuously? I'm going to put her on too.
Yeah. Okay, Saihoji is in the south, sort of southwest corner of Kyoto. Its particular situation is that it's on the north side of a slope of a not a high mountain, but of a hill. And being on the north side, it doesn't get a lot of direct sunlight. And if you've ever grown moss, you'll know that that's the kind of environment that the moss likes. Historically, it's one of the earliest temple gardens that survives, although it's changed a bit over the course of its history. And there's some evidence that when it was first built, it was not nearly so mossy. But the moss has been very happily growing there, and they decided at some point to encourage it rather than discourage it. It's a garden that has its own kind of very gentle aesthetic. There's a softness that the moss imparts to it that you miss in a more garden where the rocks are surrounded by more gravel, for example, which has a higher contrast and a much, in some ways, harsher feeling. So Saihoji, for me, is a place where I feel like I can relax and really enjoy the moss and the stroll very quietly. It's a garden that's got some complicated politics around it, by which I don't mean 14th century politics when it was made, although I'm sure there are some in that too, but 20th and 21st century politics. Saihoji was one of a group of temples that sort of revolted when the Kyoto city government imposed a visitation tax on all temples, taxing the entrance fees and the income from the entrance fees as a part of general tax on tourism. Saihoji at the time was having a problem because the exhaust fumes from tour buses in its parking lot were affecting the moss badly. So after they couldn't get the tour buses to just shut off while they were waiting for people, eventually Saihoji took the radical action of stopping all tourist visits. And the only way for a long time, about 10 years, I think, the only way you could see the garden was not to get admission as a tourist. Partly they didn't want to pay the tax, partly they didn't want the tour buses. But you could sign up to copy a sutra, for which there's a fee, but that's a religious ceremony fee, not an admission fee. And in thanks for copying the sutra, they would let you see the garden. So the only way to see the garden was to sign up as a sutra copyist. They didn't care how well you copied it, just that you copied it. But it prevented the tour bus phenomenon. And so it's become an even quieter, a gentler garden since then because of its radical action to keep the tourist out.
I was wondering why they wouldn't let me finish copying the sutra. Hustled me out so the next group could come in. All right. Hey. Frank, that appears to be it for our questions. There are many thanks on the chat box that you might want to read, and I'll be sure to leave that up for everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Frank L. Chance, for an illuminating presentation. Thanks to the original webinar audience for their provocative questions and shared knowledge. The conversation afforded the chance to imbibe the lecture information and form connections with like-minded people. Thanks to the Japanese people who over generations developed the life and living environment that's the subject of these webinars, and who've generously shared this gift with the world. Thanks to the many artists, craftsmen, scholars, and organizations worldwide and here in the USA who've made this known. Notably, the North American Japanese Garden Association, NAJCA, Bonsai and Suiseki Clubs, Japan-US Sister City Association, and Sukiya Living Magazine, which shows and tells how this living environment's intangible essence may be realized all over the world with a diversity of tangible materials and forms, not necessarily Japanese on their surface. They have universalized it as the Sukiya style living environment. Thanks to the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership for financial support, and the Oakland Fukuoka Sister City Association for producing these webinars. We invite you to view other recorded webinars in the Japanese Style Living Environment webinar series. Thank you, and see you next time.